This video was sponsored by Skillshare. More from them in a bit. Remember Star Trek? You had Picard, Kirk, good times. Then they ruined it. Mass Effect, Terminator, Pirates of the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. No franchise is immune from death, from falling into irrelevance. Nothing is too big to fail, and neither was Star Wars. I know for like the past decade or so, one of the most common talking points on the internet is how Disney killed Star Wars. You know, Disney, they killed Star Wars, they stabbed him right in the face. But nobody seems to agree exactly how they killed Star Wars. I assume everyone can agree though that it's dead. Recently, the Disney Plus streaming show, The Acolyte, was not renewed for a second season. Now this is interesting because one, the show explicitly set up for a second season, and two, it's a Star Wars show. The fact that a Star Wars TV show could even underperform so badly that it doesn't get a conclusion to its plotline is astounding. Yet, here we are. I mean, it wasn't a huge surprise to most. We knew that the viewership was low, we knew that the numbers were down, and we knew this thing cost a lot of money to make. This whole situation is more than just a little bit embarrassing. But this alone isn't what killed Star Wars. And it wasn't the stupid Ubisoft game either. No, Star Wars was dead way before this point. And I kind of want to just figure out how this happened. Skillshare has the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes in countless categories from music production, marketing, illustration, game design, graphic design, and so much more. So I've been doing YouTube for like 8 years now, and making thumbnails has always been a complicated process. Because I don't have Photoshop, I gotta make the whole thing inside Final Cut Pro. To get a good quality picture, I gotta play this in full screen, pause it several frames after it starts. I gotta press Command-Shift-3, and sometimes this weird watermark gets in the way. It's a whole process, not fun. And yeah, a lesson, automate your Final Cut Pro screenshots, batch export stills from video, taught me I can just save any frame to a PNG and make a thumbnail that way, which is significantly easier. This is a part of a learning path, a series of lessons all about Final Cut Pro on Skillshare, and new updates to Skillshare make it easier to find classes based on specific software that you want to learn. And by the end of this course, you'll be able to make your own videos in Final Cut Pro. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial for Skillshare. Get started today. Star Wars. Star Wars is a big series, very popular. Lots of people really seem to like it. If you look at the top grossing media franchises of all time, not just movies, Star Wars is not at the top, actually. It's Pokemon. But right beneath that is also not Star Wars. Keep going. There we are. But here's the thing. A vast majority of Pokemon and Mickey Mouse and Winnie the Pooh's value comes from the merchandise. Just the merchandise. The toys, the plushes, the puppets, the toothbrushes. Star Wars is different. Its value is more spread out between movies, shows, books, games, and merch. Far more so than any of these other top franchises. Honestly, you could make a really good argument that Star Wars is the single most valuable media franchise in the world. Or at least it was. Until Disney killed it. Look, Star Wars has seen its fair shares of ups and downs well before Disney got its greedy little paws on it. So yeah, they really didn't do that bad at the box office, all things considered. But even still, Disney stopped making Star Wars movies. They moved the franchise from the silver screen to Disney Plus, and this was likely because of 2 films. One was, yeah, Solo, a Star Wars story. Turns out audiences did not have much interest in seeing a Han Solo movie that did not star the guy that made, you know, that was Han Solo. Who would have guessed? The other film was Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, the conclusion to Disney's sequel trilogy. Now, on paper, those numbers seem pretty decent. Episode 9 didn't do that bad, but it also didn't do that well. It made less money than Episode 8, which made less money than Episode 7, which means people were just losing interest. Domestically, in the US, adjusted for inflation, it actually did worse than Rogue One. The conclusion to all of Star Wars, the end of Star Wars, did worse than Rogue One. And then the franchise just moves over to streaming. The first Disney Plus Star Wars show was The Mandalorian. You might remember him. The show started off really strong in terms of viewership, cultural relevance, and critical reviews. Season 1 was a big deal. People liked it. And it showed something kind of unique about Star Wars that before this point was just speculation. You could have a show that had almost nothing to do with Jedi or Sith or lightsabers. You have this unknown character disconnected from the larger world, and it still worked. People tuned in. It proved that Disney did not need to keep bringing back nostalgia bait characters to keep the general public's interest. If you had a good story, good writing, an overall good TV show, people were gonna tune in. Quality was the secret ingredient. And Disney just could not figure this out. No, they took all the wrong lessons away from this. Kathleen Kennedy is genuinely awful at her job. I don't know how she's still employed here at Disney. I don't know if she has something on Bob Iger, some embarrassing photos from a Christmas party, but seeing her single-handedly destroy what was at one point the most valuable franchise in the world is impressive, actually. It's impressive. Rather than take away the lesson that a good show would gain more viewers, Disney just hijacked The Mandalorian and turned it into a jumping off point for countless new Star Wars spin-offs. After all, if audiences could warm up to Mando, then they could warm up to anybody else. And after this, it all just, it started to fall apart. There's often this saying online that nobody hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans. And I agree, because that's just common sense. That's how things work. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy. And that's also how franchises die, but when the audience becomes apathetic, when they stop complaining. And look, I think this is exactly what happened to a lot of people and Star Wars. There's tons of fans who were invested in this universe and got angry when it started to fall apart, but I think a lot of people just started to become apathetic as it continued to get worse. Yeah, you might see people online complaining about the Acolyte or the new Star Wars video game or all that stuff, but I'm sure the general public just doesn't care, because to them, Star Wars already died a long time ago. Disney just doesn't understand what Star Wars fans like. They also don't understand common sense. I get that they like money. That's kind of their whole thing. But sometimes the best way to make that money is to respect the fans and respect your brand. So we've learned a few things over all these years. At one point, it was kind of assumed that you could just slap the Star Wars name on anything and it would sell. But clearly that's not the case. Like the Han Solo movie. Yeah, it was probably a flop in large part to it being, again, a Han Solo movie without Harrison Ford. But I have to imagine if this had released before The Last Jedi, as opposed to like 6 months after, it probably would have performed a lot better. With the power of hindsight, I think it's pretty clear that that film, Episode 8, The Last Jedi, that was the point where the fan base kind of fractured. I think a lot of people forget that before this point, a lot of people, even Star Wars fans, were actually pretty happy with Disney owning the franchise. Yes, there were some debates, there was some backlash due to some decisions, but overall, people seemed optimistic. It wasn't until Episode 8 where things just fell apart. Right here, Episode 8 seems to be where Disney lost its core fan base. Core fans, they're important. You know, the hardcore fans, the people that will go out and consistently buy your stuff, that will tell people about your stuff. Yes, they're not a majority of the consumers, but they are always going to be your most important customers. See, most people that like Star Wars don't love Star Wars. They just kinda like Star Wars. They're aware of Star Wars. You know, they think that Darth Vader is kinda cool. Big fan of the little green dude. They felt that the death of Spock was handled tastefully. I guarantee you that most people that watch Star Wars Episode 7 have no idea what an Ahsoka is. But here's the thing, even if most people are casual fans, you still need to get the core fans on board to get the casuals interested. But if you push away this core fan base for long enough, if you just keep telling them, yeah, we don't really need you anymore, eventually they're gonna leave. and they're not going to come back, and they're not going to tell the non-fans, the casuals, the general audience to watch your stuff. Star Wars not only couldn't sustain itself, in movie theaters and the box office, but it can't even sustain itself with Disney Plus streaming shows at this point. They've pissed off the original fans, they've failed to get new ones, and at this point, who's left? People hate watching The Acolyte to see what wacky stuff Harvey Weinstein's assistant comes up with this week. So how would you fix this? Well, honestly, it would not be that hard. Like, you could probably grab a random Star Wars fan. No, a random person off the street, put them in charge of this franchise, and they would do a better job than Kathleen Kennedy. You could get somebody who doesn't know or care about Star Wars to tell you why creating a movie that is a continuation of a TV show with plummeting ratings is a bad financial move. Or take something like, I don't know, the video games. Disney doesn't develop Star Wars games themselves, they license out the property to big publishers. But even in the case of Respawn's games that were received pretty well, that only came about because Disney made the initial terrible decision to give the license to EA. EA voted worst company in America twice. By doing this, Disney kind of ended up doing more harm than good to the Star Wars brand, because Disney just picked the highest bidder. I have to imagine they did the same thing when it came to Ubisoft. Yeah, the new game, Star Wars Outlaws by Ubisoft, has received pretty mixed reviews. It has not sold well, it has done terribly. Ubisoft is like dying over there, and everybody's asking why. Well, I mean, for one, doesn't seem like that good of a game. That's probably a big part of it. But also there's just, common sense stuff. If Star Wars Outlaws starred Han Solo or Boba Fett, it probably would have brought more people in than this standard fare Ubislop. But instead, the publisher had to leave their own mark on the Star Wars universe, which resulted in an utterly forgettable game that nobody will mention in a year from now, except for when people do retrospectives on how Ubisoft went bankrupt. Yeah, the failure of Star Wars Outlaws is on Ubisoft. Disney did not make this game, but Disney should have known better than to pick Ubisoft as the publisher. Like, what happened to the days when LucasArts would hand-pick talented developers to make good Star Wars games? Remember that? Remember those days? In recent years, I think Disney just forgot what makes a brand valuable. Let's take something like the MCU. While initially there was a level of prestige with this, this thing, when that was new, most films, almost every film, was at least decent, if not good. And the expectation was that if you went and seen the new MCU film, you were at least going to be entertained. You'd have an enjoyable time. Of course, over the years, there was a few misses, but the good outweighed the negative. But then there was more misses, and then more bad movies, and then more bad movies than good movies. And all the prestige and the goodwill that was built up, that vanished, and films started making a lot less money. The next Marvel MCU film could be good, or it could be a disaster, and nobody really knows because the Marvel name in film doesn't really mean anything anymore. The brand has lost all its goodwill and all its prestige. And this is really what happened to Star Wars over the past decade. Yeah, before this point, Star Wars had misses. Like, I'm not gonna sit here and say that Episode 2 was actually a masterpiece, but there was a lot more good in the property than bad, whether it be shows or games or just anything. But now it's almost entirely bad, with extremely few exceptions. Too much of anything is annoying, but too much of a bad thing is really annoying. When Disney starts pumping out streaming show after streaming show, project after project, it doesn't give you a chance to miss Star Wars. Instead, it makes it really easy to dislike Star Wars. If I go into a store and I see a Baby Yoda toy, it actively annoys me. Something goes off in my brain neurons that tells me, this thing bad. It's all oversaturation. It gets to a point where Star Wars, which was once kinda cool, has just become lame, generic, corporate garbage slop, pumped out month after month, year after year, designed by committees and executives who think they know what will sell, but it's not selling. I do think Star Wars is dead, and I think the reason it's dead above all else is because it kind of got too big. Say what you want about George Lucas and his prequels, but at least it was the product of a man and a vision. But under Disney, under this corporation, it's just too enticing for Hollywood hacks, for corporate executives to sink their claws into. This property starts attracting these kinds of vultures who just want to use it for their own personal gain rather than respect the fans and the source material. I actually liked Porgs. Again, huge thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I think it's a great service. I think you should check it out. In the first 500 people to use my link in the description will get a month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today.